All right, folks, let's get this started, huh? The very last lecture of the semester, if you can believe that. Like, we just started this like a couple of weeks ago, it feels. Or maybe not. It doesn't feel that way to you, but maybe it feels like forever to you. But for me, it feels like we just met, and now we're going to say goodbye, and it's sad. But it's not quite done yet. Obviously, we have a little bit more material to cover today, and then we have, of course, the very formal process of having you take the final and demonstrate how much you've learned in this class, which I'm sure will go really well because you've taken my advice and you've been working really hard, even before the break, to study for finals already. That's been happening, right? Exactly. Very good. Ideally, this is a real response that you guys are giving me, and you have been doing that because that is the right approach, folks. It's like it's really easy to like just get lost in this process, which can be very weighty as far as like all the information you're exposed to and all the different things you have to do, and kind of lose track of like what you should be doing. And all of this is very manageable for anybody. Any class you take is a class you can get an A in. Any class. And again, it's just a function of how much time and dedication you put into the course. So if you wind up in a class like mine, or even more difficult courses, and the material is like a lot, it's very complicated, very dense, like it just means you got to sit down for more hours and just stare at the book, stare at your notes, stare at the computer screen, whatever, as long as it takes until you figure it out. And once you figure it out, it's like it clicks and you're like, oh, I got this, I can get this, I can get the next thing, I can get anything, and then you move forward. So just remember that. Don't let like the constraints of the semester put you into a position where you wind up not doing well, and then you start to question yourself. You start to question, can I even do this? Is this something I can even do? And then you start to believe that maybe you aren't capable of doing A, B, and C, which is absurd. You're capable of doing anything. And again, it's just a matter of like how dedicated you're willing to be to it and how much work you're willing to put into it. So just always keep that in mind. And if you do wind up in a situation where you falter in a particular area, like maybe in this class, you're not doing too well, maybe you walk away not doing too well in the course, you have to realize, well, it's not because you're incapable of doing well. It's just you didn't put in enough time. That's it. You didn't put in enough effort. And if you want to retake the course, if you want to take a more advanced version of the course, like take it and just realize like you need to sit down and put more time into it. And when you do that, you're going to do really well in it, and you're going to feel really good about what you've done, and just, again, actualize your full potential, realize that you have it, and then actually see it in practice, and then become like the best you can possibly become. So get that in here. Get that in here. Take this approach in everything moving forward. Ideally, well, realistically, some of you already have been taking this approach, and so good for you. But those of you that haven't, like, just please don't let anything that happens in college like give you the wrong idea about what you're capable of. That is the biggest mistake you can make in college, is to walk away from any course and feel like, oh, well, I can't do this, I am incapable of this, because that is actual failure, not some silly mark on your progress report or whatever it is, on the computer, whatever. I don't know, wherever you see the grades. Those things don't really matter. What really matters is what's going on inside of you. And again, this whole process is about you realizing what you can do. And whenever you hit a wall and you create this idea that you are incapable of doing something, that is real failure. Avoid that at all costs. All right, folks, we are at the very end of the semester. It's bittersweet, obviously. I will admit to you that you have been my favorite group this semester. If not just of this semester, but of my entire time at CSUN. So I want. You never know what you're gonna get. It's like a box of chocolates, right? You never know what you're gonna get in a class, And believe me, I've gotten some duds. I've been into that chocolate, and it's like been bitter, and it has stung my tongue, and it has left a mark in my mouth. I have had that happen, but that has not been the case for this class. I overall have been very pleasantly surprised by the quality of the people, the variety of all of you, and just everything else that comes along with that. So thank you for that. It's not over yet. Keep it up. At the very least for a couple more meetings, including today, so that we can walk away with a really pleasant memory, at least on a personal level. To the extent that we can have that personal relationship, given the nature of this interaction, but. Because again, whatever happens with your grade, you just have to accept that. I don't look at the grades and say, oh, well, I really like this person, I'm going to give them an A. Oh, I really hate this person, I'm giving them an F. No, I don't look at the names. I look at the numbers. I look at your performance, and I give you your grade. That's what I do. It has nothing to do with you personally. It just has to do with fairness, right? You have to be fair in a position like this. You can't in any way allow the fairness to waver, because then it all falls apart. Then you have no credibility. What's the point of anything you set forth for people? Then in the end, if it's subjective and completely biased, what's the meaning of that? Nothing. So I try to just be as pure as possible in my approach to grading and all that. So again, for those of you that are going to walk away not feeling too good, and again, it's not necessarily people that are sitting in this room. It could be people, obviously, that are at home that are not listening to my lectures, because there's people that actually don't come to class and don't watch my lectures either, which for me is just mind-blowing. But there are people that do just watch the lectures, and they actually wind up doing pretty good in the class. So there's a group of those, a small group, that is doing that, and the rest of them are just don't care. But whatever. The point is that in the end, the class is what it is, but as far as who you are, that is independent of the class. And regardless of what you walk away with as far as a grade in this course, it doesn't reflect who you are or what you're capable of. You've demonstrated that to me personally, and in the end, if you haven't realized yet what you're capable of, then my sincerest hope is that you do at some point realize it, and then just make it a reality for yourself, so that everybody can see it, including yourself. All right, folks, enough with the sentimental stuff. Let's move on to the business at hand, which of course is to cover the final chapter we're covering in this course, which has to do with open economy macroeconomics. So we've been dealing with a very specific perspective on the economy, which is the perspective on a domestic economy, specifically in the U.S., but I have talked about how a lot of the principles that are enacted within our policy regime that we have here is consistent throughout most developed countries, and emerging countries as well have also taken the model of what is done to manage the economy in countries like ours to also do the same thing in theirs. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on the level of corruption and how well their systems work. But overall, what we've learned in this class is basically the approach to managing an economy at the macro level, the tools that governments have to try to spur growth, or try to rein in inflation, try to decrease unemployment, overall increase the best conditions possible for the populations that they govern. So it's been a very sort of isolationist view or approach so far, because we haven't considered the international economy, and the fact that every country has their own currency, but every other country has their own currency as well, and so there is the price of a currency in terms of another country, and vice versa, which are the exchange rates, which we'll talk about today, and how that can affect both the economy and how the economy can affect those exchange rates, and sort of these links, how it's all sort of linked. So we'll start to talk about some of these issues in this chapter, close off the course. And then ideally, for those of you that are interested in the stuff we touch upon here, you will move forward in your understanding of these things, because ultimately the things that we talk about in this course, but specifically we talk about in this chapter, are probably some of the most important aspects of the world that we live in. They are the most influential. It's you have an idea of how the world works. And it's sort of it's kind of like a watered down idea because you're not always exposed to like the highly technical information you need to truly understand, macroeconomics and like macroeconomic policy and international connections. But that is really the dimension that is like as as controlling as possible of our lives, and yet it is invisible to some extent if you don't truly understand it. But ideally, in this class, at this point, you understand to some extent how important these forces are and how much influence they do have over your lives, and therefore how much value it has for you to move forward and learn even more about these things, like become more precise in your understanding of them. Of course, some of you aren't going to go forward in business, some of you aren't going to go forward in economics, and this is it for you as far as like your exposure to these things. At the very least, though, you have been exposed to these ideas and you will have them as a reference to be able to kind of refer back to, not necessarily all the time and not necessarily like in the precise way that you're expected to know it for the exams in this course, but just as far as like you kind of go making your way through life and being exposed to things that are happening throughout the world and the news, etc. Like you'll come across concepts that you've encountered in this course that you may not know too well, but if you do like a quick search on Wikipedia, do a quick read of whatever, it'll remind you of what you covered here, and it'll just help you once again to understand the world a little bit better so that you can then be a little bit more confident about how the world works around you and therefore your place within it, which is ultimately what all this learning is about. But for those of you that do wind up moving forward, again, like this is one of the most important dimensions of our lives. The international like economic arena is probably the most exciting area that exists in our world in terms of like things that are happening beyond like actual like physical sciences and biological and sciences and chemistry and all that, where there's advances being made that are going to maybe prolong our lives indefinitely or maybe get us to Saturn or whatever, things of that sort. Beyond that, like what's actually happening on this planet, the international economic arena is the most exciting, and so it's worth your time to really get to know it and really maybe try to find your place within it and see how maybe you can flourish within it, of course, like be successful within it, but also use it to advance your own sort of path, whatever that may be. Maybe that path involves you advancing our ways of interacting on such a level, and therefore maybe ultimately improving the state of the world, because again, like everything is connected. And so if you can come up with like a new approach to maybe transacting that might in some way affect every level of the class structure that we all live in, that could really have a big impact on the welfare of the population of the entire world. But it all hinges on you kind of like having a firm understanding of these interconnections that we have been talking about in this class, and we will further talk about in this chapter. So just be interested in it beyond just like, I want to get an A on the test. Like that's great for now, but like again, like your lives are long, and like so much can happen in those lifetimes, and like there's so much potential, and like again, like this arena is the arena where like the things are happening, like not what's happening with Justin Bieber, not what's happening with like I don't know, crap. The crap that you hear about all the time in the news that like is just meant to kind of keep us interested or whatever in whatever's happening in the moment. Like those aren't the things that are important. The things that are important are the things that we've talked about in this course and we will talk about today. So just keep that in mind. And if you haven't yet developed a passion for it, you may develop a passion for it. So don't write it off just yet. You are in the middle of a class. Classes tend to, create all sorts of emotions with respect to, the pressure and all this stuff, and maybe like, you're not getting the kind of grade you want or whatever. You have to eventually separate yourself from those feelings and like truly see the value of the information, and then ideally use it as a foundation for, again, moving onwards and forwards in your lives. So things to keep in mind beyond just lecture, exam, what's going to be on the final, etc. I hope that at least some of you do take a path within this realm, because it is worth your time. It is worth your dedication. It is worth your sacrifice ultimately. All right, so as far as this chapter goes, it's going to be very basic and very introductory, but it's going to give you some idea of how some of the stuff we've been talking about sort of um, it bleeds into like the interactions economically that happen internationally. So the first thing we're going to talk about is capital flows and the balance of payments. The balance of payments is like the way that we keep track of all transactions that occur internationally. It's a very sort of technical approach to kind of accounting for all transactions. So we'll talk about that in detail. Capital flows, again, is like money that's going from one country to another, savings that are being used to invest in one country versus another. So we'll talk about how things are being accounted for and how capital flows sort of are related to the needs of a country in maybe one type of market versus another type of market. Then we'll talk about the role of the exchange rate and how the exchange rate is sort of the main price that kind of equalizes all economic activity in a particular country between the amount of transactions that happen in goods and services markets versus transactions that happen in like financial markets. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how the exchange rate is defined and its relationship to these international capital flows. Then we'll talk about exchange rate policy. So like any price that has a big impact on an economy, the exchange rate is a tool also of policymakers. It can have a big impact on the way the economy is behaving at any particular time, because again, the demand and supply of either goods and services or like capital overseas is going to affect our markets, which will affect our economy. And so there are policies with respect to how the exchange rate is set and maybe the level at which it should be set at for each country, depending on what their needs are, depending on whether they're developing or developed, or they have certain industries that are emerging versus industries that have been around for a long time. And then, of course, we'll talk about the relationship between exchange rates and macroeconomic policy. Again, like we've been talking about macro policy, so the things that we have been talking about as far as like setting interest rates in the U.S. and the maybe adjusting the money supply, like how then that affects international transactions, which then also in turn affect our economy. And so we'll talk about those relationships in some fine detail. So again, here's chapter 19. What we're going to learn again is the meaning of what's called the balance of payments on account. It's the accounting sheet that tells us, you know, what's going out and what's coming in, and what that is, and where that money is going and why. Well, not why, like in terms of the determinants, but in terms of like why it falls into one category versus another. We'll talk about the determinants of international capital flows, the role of foreign exchange markets. Foreign exchange markets are the markets in which the currencies of countries are exchanged, so we'll talk about those markets and how they affect the exchange rate. We'll talk about the importance of the real exchange rate and their role on what's called the current account. So the real exchange rate is like anything else that's real in economics. It's the exchange rate adjusted for price levels, but it's a little bit more complicated when we're talking about international real value, because there's going to be two price levels that have to come into consideration if we're thinking about transactions between two countries. We have to think about what's happening with prices in both countries. So it gets a little bit more complicated. This is an area that's not simple. So if you decide that this is an area that you want to work in throughout your life, you have to just acknowledge that it's a complicated area, and that's why it's so exciting, because not a lot of people know about it, and we haven't truly completely figured it out yet. And so it is worth people's time to try to figure it out and try to advance it and try to advance our knowledge of it and try to advance our ability to work in that arena. We'll talk about considerations that lead countries to choose different exchange rate regimes such as a fixed exchange rate versus a floating exchange rate. So some countries want to fix their exchange rate. They want to say, well, the price of my currency is going to be constant. In order to do that, they have to do a certain amount of things, which we'll talk about, versus a floating exchange rate that just allows like the demand and supply forces in international markets to determine that price. And we'll talk about like the benefits and drawbacks to both approaches. We'll talk about why open economy considerations affect macroeconomic policy under floating exchange rates. Again, some more sort of links between macro and the exchange rate, what we're talking about here. All right, so this is The Economist from this week, actually, December 3rd to the 9th, 2016. This is our very interesting cover. I don't think George Washington has ever been depicted that way. I don't think they had steroids back then, but maybe they did. I don't know. We don't have like precise photographs, but anyway, this basically is talking about how like our dollar has been appreciating quite a bit in international markets. It's become a strong currency, and talks about sort of the issues related to that. So it starts off by saying, in the 3 weeks following Donald Trump's victory in America's presidential election, the dollar had one of its sharpest rises ever against a basket of rich country peers. So just on the news that Donald Trump was going to become president strengthened our dollar quite a bit. So investors believe that Trump will cut taxes, as he said he would, and spend more on infrastructure. So we know, based on our understanding of fiscal policy, that cutting taxes will shift our aggregate demand curve, right? Disposable income will go up, right? Disposable income, again, being like the income that households make, minus the amount of taxes they have to pay, plus the transfer payments, right? So if taxes are cut, disposable income goes up, that increases the amount of income in all households, which shifts the aggregate demand curve, right? Shifts it to the right, which gets us to a higher equilibrium GDP in the economy. So that's one effect of what his policies claim to be eventually going to do. And then, of course, he has claimed also that he's going to spend a lot of money on rebuilding our infrastructure, our crumbling infrastructure, which is what? What kind of spending is that? It's government spending. It's government spending, right? It's part of fiscal policy. It's a fiscal policy involves taxing and spending, right? But it is government spending. Government will be spending money on our roads, our buildings, etc. Supposedly, we'll see. And what's that going to do to our aggregate demand? Shift it to what direction? To the right, right? It's also going to increase aggregate demand. So if that happens, what's going to happen to our price level? It's going to increase, right? It's going to increase the equilibrium price, right? So, so let's look at what the article says about that. This is going to lead the Fed to raise rates to stem the rising inflation. So, because prices will be going up, the Fed is going to raise rates. How are they going to raise rates? How does the Federal Reserve raise interest rates? Lend out less money. So remember, they don't lend money. The Fed doesn't lend money. So if they sell their bonds, right, so it's going to lower the money supply, right? So they're going to sell a bunch of bonds. The commercial banks are going to buy the bonds. They're going to buy the bonds from the Federal Reserve Bank, and therefore their reserves will go down, which will lower the money supply via the money multiplier process. Very good. And that will, so remember, the money supply is a vertical line, right? And you've got the demand curve. So if the money supply shifts to the left, then that increases the interest rate, right? If that increases the interest rate, then that's going to increase the opportunity cost of investing. That means investors are going to want to invest less, right? So that'll lower aggregate demand, right? So that'll bring aggregate demand back to the left, right? So that's essentially what the article's saying that will likely happen, and so that will that will lead to rising interest rates. So in the time since Trump was elected, the 10-year bonds return has risen from 2.3%, has risen to 2.3% from 1.7% on election night. So 10-year bonds are long-term bonds. We talked about a couple of chapters ago how long-term interest rates basically embody information about what could be happening to short-term interest rates. And so because there's this expectation that short-term interest rates will rise, that's what caused this long-term interest rate to rise, right? So when long-term interest rates rise, that is going to have an effect on capital flows, the amount of money that's flowing into the country. So when interest rates rise, when interest rates rise in so think about like international investors that have a bunch of money and they're like, I want to get the highest return I can on my investment. If interest rates rise in the US, then they're going to want to invest in the US. They're going to want to buy bonds in the US. They're going to want to buy any kind of long-term assets because, as we've said, like interest rates move together. And so in order to buy stuff in the US, international investors need to buy dollars. So they need to buy US dollars. So if you increase the demand for dollars, that is going to increase the price of the dollar. So there's reasons why the dollar has been strengthening, and this will further strengthen the dollar. So the article goes on to talk about that a strong dollar is dangerous for the world and for the US. So let's talk about why that is. So let's first talk about the reasons that the article talks about for a strengthening dollar over the last few years. One reason is that 60% of the world population and world GDP is transacted in dollars. So a lot of like the emerging countries that have been developing due to like the forces that lead folks to have that economic growth we've talked about. Again, the three main sources are increases in capital, physical capital, the productive capital, the man-made goods that are used to produce, technological advancements, and also increase in human capital, education, right? So those are the three things. And we know that emerging economies, countries that have not been developed, have been developing over the course of like the last 20 or 30 years, specifically because they've been adapting all of the advancements that we have in like the developed countries quickly in their countries, which is causing huge, fast economic growth. But beyond that, like their financial systems aren't that great. Like international investors are always nervous about investing in those kind of environments because they're risky. There aren't enough laws in place to protect investors, things of that sort. And that's why a lot of these countries wind up taking on the dollar as like the main currency within their country, even though they still have their own currency. As far as like international transactions go, like, they establish sort of this standard for transacting with the dollar, which then makes international investors, more confident about their ability to, invest in the countries, have their investments protected, etc. Because the value of the dollar won't be subject to, whatever could happen within the country. We talked about hyperinflation last time and how that could basically erase the value of a currency because, the government starts to borrow too much money or print too much money to pay its bills. So investors from other countries want to avoid the risk of that, putting their money in another country's currency and having that money evaporate. So the dollar has been taken by a lot of these emerging countries as like the standard for like these big international transactions that help them to grow economically. So that's one reason the dollar has been strengthening over the last few years. Emerging market countries have been issuing dollar-denominated bonds. So emerging countries, again, these developing countries, the governments themselves, when they issue their bonds, essentially borrowing money, right? When you issue a bond, you're borrowing money from whoever buys the bond, and then you promise to pay them back with some interest. They've been issuing dollar-denominated bonds so that, again, people feel confident in buying these bonds and the fact that they're going to be paid interest in dollars versus their country's currency. So the value of their investment will be protected. So when the dollar strengthens, what happens is the cost of servicing those debts goes up. So again, the dollar becomes more valuable, and as far as like a developing country's own currency, whenever the dollar becomes stronger, it becomes stronger relative to the value of their currency. And so then their currency is not as strong as the dollar, meaning that they need to trade more of their money to get a dollar. And when the dollar becomes stronger, that means that they need to pay more in their currency to pay the interest on the debts that they're issuing to international investors. And so then that starts to restrict the amount of economic activity that can happen in the country, because any kind of like excess money that exists is being used to then service these loans, or the investments from international investors, which then halts the ability of like the actual country to have like a thriving economy. So a strengthening dollar has that effect, which is partly why it's bad for the world. When that happens, investors start to pull out of these countries because they're not getting the kind of returns they want. And so by pulling out of the countries, then that weakens the asset prices more within the country, which then constricts their economies more. The strengthening dollar is also a problem for us. So if the dollar becomes too strong internationally, the trade deficit will deepen. We will be able to buy more things overseas because our dollar will buy more stuff overseas. But in turn, our stuff that we sell overseas is going to be more expensive to people because the price of our stuff is in dollars. And so if our dollar is worth more in terms of other countries' currencies, then they have to pay us more for our goods, which means that they buy less of our stuff. And so therefore we buy more and they buy less, and our trade deficit becomes larger. So Donald Trump has talked about how he wants to be protectionist, how he wants to basically put up trade barriers by putting up huge tariffs, which are taxes on imports, in order to try to sort of halt our dependence on the rest. Well, not our dependence, but our interconnectedness with the rest of the world as far as our goods and services markets go, and the other markets related to that, which is a problem because as I've mentioned before, the world has been getting more connected internationally, and that's a good thing. We should be doing that because the more we're connected, the more we ultimately wind up boosting everybody up to the same level. That's just sort of the trajectory of that kind of behavior. When a country starts to close himself off from the world, especially a powerful country like us, then that has a huge impact on that trajectory, and that can be a problem. So that's a problem, and of course, the fact that the dollar is strengthening and the deficit will weaken will be more impetus, more sort of motivation for Donald Trump to enact these protectionist policies that, again, will hurt the world economy. So these are some issues that are being talked about with respect to the value of our currency and some of the connections that we have with the rest of the world. This is being talked about right now. And so these are issues that are relevant. They're always relevant. There's always things to talk about with respect to these issues. But definitely right now, there's a lot going on because of Brexit, what happened in the European Union, which, that's something that was established a long time ago, 30 years ago or something like that. That trade association essentially amongst the European nations is something that became kind of a staple. And to get out of that is an ugly process, but it creates a lot of economic uncertainty, which is then creating turbulence in international markets. And again, a lot of the health of any economy has to do with how people feel about it. Because, as we know, money is polarized in the hands of a few in this world. The top 1% own 50% of the world's wealth. So if you have such a small amount of people that have so much of the wealth, if they feel that things are not going too well, they're going to pull back, right? They start pulling back in terms of what they're willing to invest, in terms of how invested they want to be in the world, and therefore that starts to constrict our economic activity overall, and it starts to affect everybody at every level and can be disastrous. And so pay attention to this stuff. It's important. Is ultimately what this whole thing's about. Anyway, but at the very least, beyond this chapter though, I hope you'll try to pick up The Economist every now and then and try to figure out what it's talking about. There's a lot. It's a very dense magazine. It comes out once a week, and there's a lot in there. But if you just kind of check out what's happening with the leaders, what's happening in politics, what's happening in business, and then maybe look at international finance stuff. And then at the end, it has like all the economic indicators that we've been talking about. So like it lists all of them for all the countries: GDP, inflation, unemployment, blah blah blah. So it's got all that information in there as well. So you can really like keep track of this stuff, and it'll also help you kind of remember a lot of what you learned in this class, because it is going to require you to have like kind of that language available to you so that you can really understand what they're talking about and ultimately understand what's going on with the world. So actually that would probably be the best advice I could give you. If you're interested in like really holding on to what you learn here and kind of bringing it forward, get plugged into what's actually happening in the world that requires the language of this class to understand it, in order for you to kind of maintain your connection to it, and then ultimately create that foundation for you to like spring forward into whatever you wind up doing. So good idea to check out the magazine at least every now and then. I've got the iTunes subscription. It's $30 every 3 months or something. It's fairly expensive, relatively expensive, but it's worth it. It's always in your phone or whatever. You can always bring it up and read about whatever, and just stay plugged in. And again, and it's got a cool function where like you can highlight a word and like it'll define it for you or whatever. So you can like keep up to date with what's going on as well as the language. Anyway, stuff is being talked about today that is relevant to what we're doing in this class, and that's important. So just keep that in mind always. So let's talk about capital flows and the balance of payments first. So in Chapter 7, we learned that economists keep track of the domestic economy using what's called the National Income and Product Account. So that, again, was meant to sort of just measure the amount of output, final goods and services produced in an economy, GDP, right? We know that there's 3 different ways of measuring GDP, as the value of all income in the economy, the value of everything that's sold in the economy, and the value of all goods and services in the economy. But that's just a domestic accounting of what's happening economically within a country. The balance of payments accounts is what we're going to look at here. Tells us what's happening internationally. So economists keep track of international transactions using a different but related set of numbers, the balance of payments account. So let's talk about these balance of payments accounts. It's a summary of a country's transactions with other countries. So if you consider a small scale example first, not a country, but let's say like a family farm. So there's this family, the Costas, they've got an artichoke farm. They might have some revenue from everything they sell. Revenue is price times quantity. So the quantity of something that's being sold times the price it's being sold at is the revenue. So let's say they're selling artichokes throughout the year. They're getting $100,000 for that. They have a cost of running the farm and buying the farm equipment, so that's $70,000. Buying food and paying utility bills, maybe replacing their worn-out car, that's $40,000. Let's say they also have money in the bank, and they get some interest on that, so they'll earn $500 in interest over the course of the year as well. They have to pay their mortgage, so let's say it costs $10,000 for the year. That's another thing they pay out. They take out a loan. Some of that loan is used to pay for equipment. Some of it is saved. So let's say that's $25,000. So one way to summarize the Costa's financial flows for the year is like this. So we can account for the purchase of sales of goods and services, and we can account for the interest payments and then loans and deposits. There's going to be sources of cash, money coming in, and then uses of that cash, money going out, and then there's going to be sort of like the net result of that. So like we said, artichoke sales are $100,000, so that's a source of cash, and it falls under the purchase of a sale of a good or a service. Then we have the farming operations and living expenses, so that's something that they're spending money on, and that's $110,000, so that's them purchasing goods and services. So the net amount of purchase of goods and services is the difference between the sources of cash and the uses of cash. So that's going to be, in this case, a deficit, negative $10,000. Then there's interest payments. So Interest payments are the money that's being paid to them on the money in their bank. So that's a source of cash. It's about $500 there. But they also have to pay interest on their mortgage. They have to pay their mortgage over the course of a year, but that's likely mostly interest because that's mostly what mortgages are, interest, unless you make payments larger than the ones that are expected of you, which you should, by the way. When you get a mortgage, make larger payments than they tell you to. You'll pay off your loans a lot faster. Anyway, so they're paying interest on their mortgage, which is $10,000. So as far as the interest payments go, there's also a deficit there of $9,500. As far as the loans and deposits, so the loans and deposits are slightly different than these other two things because loans and deposits can be thought of as creating some kind of liability, right? A loan is an asset to the bank, but it's a liability to you. Deposits are an asset to you, but they're a liability to the bank. So essentially, on this line, we are accounting for transactions that create liabilities. And so if you have funds that are received from that loan of $25,000, that's a source of cash that falls within that category. Again, you have taken on a $25,000 liability, and the bank now has a $25,000 asset that they own that is part of their T account, part of their assets on their T account. And of course, there's uses of this loan. We said that some of it is used and some of it is deposited. So they deposit some of that money in the bank, $5,500, and of course that is a liability to the bank and it's an asset to you. They have to pay you that money back, so that's why it's a liability to them. So as far as the loans and deposits go, there is a surplus there of $19,500. And so as far as like this amount, it's going to offset the deficit in the other two lines. So as far as sources of cash go, we're going to have a total of $125,500, and as far as uses of cash, we're also going to have a total of $125,500. And so they're going to even out, and we are going to net out to zero. So all the money that's coming in is going to wind up paying for all the stuff you're paying for, and so it's all going to even out in the end. So a country's balance of payments account is a table which summarizes the country's transactions with the rest of the world for a given year in a manner very similar to the way we just summarized the Costa's financial year. All right, so this is an example from the book. It's the U.S. balance of payments in 2013. Everything's measured in billions of dollars. The table shows a simplified version of it, and again, it's for 2013. So a country's balance of payments accounts shows payments from foreigners, so money that we are taking in from foreigners, which are sources of cash for the United States as a whole. So whenever they're buying things from us, those are sources of cash for us. So payments from foreigners, so that's what this column is going to represent. A country's balance of payments accounts also show payments to foreigners. We buy stuff overseas, and so that's us using our money to pay uses of cash of the United States as a whole to pay for whatever it is we buy from overseas. So that's money going out, and that's going to be represented by this column here, payments to foreigners. So the first line here is the sales of goods and purchases of goods and services. So basically, we're talking about imports and exports. Like we're buying goods and services from people overseas. Those are imports, and we are selling things to people overseas, and those are exports. So payments from foreigners, examples include the value of U.S. wheat exports. So that would fall under this category here. So we're selling a bunch of wheat to foreigners. Then that's going to fall under, a sale of a good or service, and it involves us getting money from overseas. So it's going to be payments from foreigners for our wheat. The fees that foreigners pay to U.S. consulting companies. So we have consulting companies, businesses overseas need us to analyze their markets, etc. So they pay us to provide them that analysis. So obviously that is them paying for our service. So we're going to get that money from them. We're exporting that service to them. And then on the other side of the sales and purchases of goods and services are the payments to foreigners, right? So that is going to represent things that we're buying from foreigners. So payments to foreigners, example, include like the value of U.S. oil imports. So all the oil we buy from like the Middle Eastern countries, from OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. We're paying them for oil. Obviously, that's going to fall under that category there. The fees that U.S. companies pay to Indian call centers, right? So a lot of like our customer service has been sourced out, right, internationally to like Indian call centers, Filipino call centers. I'm sure you have all experienced these types of customer service experiences. And of course, when we're paying for those services, we are paying them to provide us that service. So they are exporting that service to us. We are importing that service, that customer service. So we are paying those call centers. So that is going to fall under this category here. A sale of a good or purchase, payment to foreigners. Factor income. So whenever we're talking about factor anything in economics, we're talking about the factors of production. So the things that we use to produce. Factors have a price, right? If we're talking about labor workers, the price is the wage. When we're talking about capital, like the physical capital that we use to produce, the buildings, the machinery, things like that, that also has a price. We call that price in economics the rent. There's a rental rate for capital. So we're going to either be paying foreigners for their inputs into production, their factors of production, or they're going to be paying us for our factors of production that they're using. So again, so factor income is the income that foreigners paid to American residents for the use of American-owned factors of production. It's also income paid by Americans to foreigners for the use of foreign-owned factors of production. It mostly consists of investment income, such as interest paid by Americans on loans from overseas, as well as profits of American-owned corporations that operate overseas. So payments from foreigner examples include like profits earned from Disneyland Paris, right? Disneyland Paris is still part of our, domestic corporation, which is essentially international Disney, but it is centered in our country. And so even though they have a Disneyland in Paris, the park itself is earning income, right? There's factors of production being used, and so that is generating profits. So the profits earned by Disneyland Paris is going to be payments from foreigners to us. So they're paying us for our factors of production. Our factor income is part of that. The profits from that, again, that part that is owned by our corporation. The wages of an American engineer who works temporarily on a construction site in Dubai. So our workers that are working overseas that are getting paid from international companies, firms, that money is essentially payments from foreigners that we account under the factor income, and therefore falls under that category there. Payments to foreigners. So examples include profits earned by U.S. operations of Japanese auto companies, just like the profits earned by French operations of U.S. Disneyland parks. The Japanese auto companies that sell us like Nissans and like Toyotas, etc. The profits that are earned here by the U.S. operations of those branches that they have here are obviously paid to those companies in Japan, and so that is factor income that is being paid to the foreigner. So that will fall under factor income, payments to foreigners, under that category there. International transfers, the next line here. International transfers are basically just money that's being sent from residents of one country to another. And so that is what's accounted here. So, you have a bunch of workers here from Mexico that are sending money to their families in Mexico. So that's going to fall under this category. It's going to be payment to foreigners here. And then we get to this category here, asset sales and purchases. So asset sales and purchases are payments accruing from sales and purchases of assets between American residents and foreigners. So stocks, bonds, financial assets, ultimately things that do create liabilities. And that's why I made that distinction before in that simplified balance of payments account sheet for that simple family farm. because there is a distinct difference between these transactions and the transactions that occur up here. So asset sales and purchases, again, are payments accruing from sales and purchases of assets between American residents and foreigners. Payments from foreigner examples include, let's say there's a Chinese food company who purchases America's top pork packager. So they buy one of our companies. Essentially, at that point, they have a claim to the profits made by that company here, and therefore that is going to fall to under the category of payments to foreigners under the asset sales and purchases. Payments to foreigners examples, so Wall Street firms buy European debt. So Wall Street firms buy bonds issued by the European Union, or like the central bank of, not the central bank, but like the Treasury equivalent to the UK's government. They issue bonds also. Every government issues bonds. So our firms buy those bonds from overseas. Essentially, we are buying, a loan, and therefore that loan is our asset, right? And we need to be paid back. So they have a liability to us who own these bonds that belong to their governments. So that is going to fall under payments to foreigners as well. That's going to fall under payments to foreigners. So the first three rows are separated from the fourth row because of how they affect the future. The balance of payments accounts distinguish between transactions that don't create liabilities and those that do create liabilities. So transactions that don't create liabilities are considered part of what's called the balance of payments on the current account. So these first three lines all fall within that category. So adding the three give us the balance of payments on the current account, also known as just the current account, often referred to simply as the current account. The current account is a country's balance of payments on goods and services plus net international transfer payments and factor income. In practice, row 1 corresponds to the most important part of the current account. So the sales and purchases of goods and services is the most important part. Again, it embodies our imports and our exports. So the balance of payments on goods and services, this line here, is the difference between the country's exports and its imports during a given period. News reports on the economy often refer to another measure, which is the merchandise trade balance, sometimes referred to as the trade balance for short. The merchandise trade balance is the difference between a country's exports and imports of goods alone, not including services. So that's what the merchandise trade balance is, just having to do with things that we manufacture there or here, not the call center services or like the consulting services. That's not included in the merchandise trade balance. So data on international trade in services aren't as accurate as data on trade in physical goods, and that's why there is this focus on merchandise trade balance in the news. And they are also slower to arrive. So that data is also slower to be accounted for. Transactions that involve the sale or purchase of assets and do create liabilities are considered part of the balance of payments on the financial account or just the financial account. So those are the two big components of the balance of payments accounts here. It is the current account, which is made up of these first three lines, and the financial account, which is made up of just this line here. And what distinguishes them is the effect they have on the future. In a financial account, all the transactions wind up creating some sort of liability, some sort of income stream into the future, versus these transactions that are basically just like one and done, right? Like you buy something, it's over. So the financial account, again, is the difference between a country's sale of assets to foreigners and its purchases of assets from foreigners for a given period. Until a few years ago, economists often referred to the financial account as the capital account. So you might come across that in old textbooks or whatever, or old academic papers if you wind up going that far. So just keep in mind that the capital account is the financial account. In 2013, the U.S. ran a current account deficit. So in 2013, our current account was at negative 400 billion. So we had that current account deficit that we're looking at here. And also in 2013, we had a financial account surplus. So you had that current account deficit of negative 400 and a financial account surplus of 373 billion. And the reason why they didn't even out the way they should even out is because of statistical discrepancy. You're talking about a lot of accounting. Things are going to get lost in the shuffle. Some things aren't going to be accounted for properly. But the way it should work and the way it actually does work beyond like our accounting methods is like all the money is recycled. So if payments are coming out and there's excess money in a country for goods and services, and that money is used to buy assets within that country and vice versa. Yeah.
It says equals 1 plus 2 plus 3, but what exactly are you talking about?
The current account is equal to the sum of the first, second, and third line. You see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so again, that's the current account. It's accounting for the transactions that do not create a liability versus the financial account that has to do with the purchase and sale of things that do create a liability, that create a future income stream. So again, it's a basic rule of balance of payments accounting that the current account and the financial account must sum to zero. So the current account, CA, plus the financial account must be equal to zero. So payments to the rest of the world for assets must equal payments to the United States for assets, and payments to the rest of the world for goods and services, factor income, and transfers must be equal to the payments to the United States for goods, services, factor income, and transfers. As I mentioned, if you have a deficit in one, you're going to have a surplus in the other and vice versa. And so it is going to even out in the end. So let's talk a little bit more about this financial account, modeling the financial account. So a country's financial account measures its net sale of assets to foreigners. Another way to think of it is a measure of capital inflows. So we talked about capital inflows in the savings and investment chapter. We talked about how you have either a trade surplus or a trade deficit. When there's a trade deficit, that means that we're buying more goods from overseas than we're selling. Because of that, there's going to be this extra amount of savings that foreigners are going to have, which then they're going to use to lend out money here in our essentially our financial markets. And so that when we have a deficit, we're going to have net capital inflows. If we have a surplus, we're going to have net capital outflows. So that's what we're talking about with capital inflows here. So foreign savings that are available to finance domestic investment spending is essentially what we're talking about with capital inflows. We can gain insight into the motivations for capital flows that are the result of private decisions by using our trusty old loanable funds model. So in using this model, we make two important simplifications. One is that all capital inflows take the form of loans. So we don't think about the other forms that it can take, such as like stocks, etc. And we ignore the effects of expected changes in exchange rates. So we ignore the effect of what people are going to expect to happen, independent of what's happening within the loan markets. So consider a world with only two countries, the U.S. and Great Britain. So the U.S., of course, is going to have its domestic demand for loans, right? Everybody that's looking to borrow money is going to be embodied in this demand within the U.S. There's going to be a supply of loans within the U.S., and that's going to establish an equilibrium interest rate within the U.S., right? So that's the equilibrium interest rate in the U.S. at 6%. And let's say in Great Britain, they also have their domestic demand for loans, loanable funds, people that want to borrow money in Great Britain. And of course, there's some supply of loanable funds in Great Britain as well. And they happen to equilibrate at 2%. So they have a 2% interest rate in Britain based on the assumptions we made here. So British lenders over here are attracted to the high interest rates in the U.S., right? People with money want to get the highest return possible. Money is generally not restricted to one country based on the interconnectedness of our international economy that we have, at least amongst developed countries. And therefore, if you have investors that have money to lend out in Britain, they could also lend it out in the U.S. And of course, if they can get a 2% return or a 6% return, they're going to opt for the 6% return, obviously. So British lenders are attracted by high U.S. interest rates, and that will send some of their loanable funds to the United States. So what's going to happen is that the supply of then U.S. loanable funds will increase, and that will shift our loanable fund supply to the right, which will lower our equilibrium interest rate in the U.S. as a result of that. In Great Britain, when you have obviously some of the supply being sent to the U.S., then that's going to lower the supply of loanable funds in Great Britain. And so that means that the supply of loanable funds in the U.S. will decrease. And so that will shift the supply of loanable funds to the left, which will then increase the interest rate in the U.K. So when residents of the two countries believe that a foreign asset is as good as a domestic one, which is what we assume here, and that a foreign liability is as good as a domestic one, then international capital flows will equalize the interest rates in the two countries. So given that there is an incentive for these savings to flow out of one country to another in order to get that higher return, that's eventually going to lead both markets to equilibrate at the same interest rate. And so within the US and within Great Britain, let's assume that they equilibrate at 4%. So in the US, that is lower than our domestic equilibrium interest rate. At a 4% interest rate, we're going to have an excess amount of demand. More people are going to be wanting loans than domestic suppliers are going to be willing to give. And so the gap is then filled in by US importing funds from Britain. And so therefore, that gap is the capital inflows to the United States. And then in Great Britain, we're going at 4%, which is above their equilibrium. You're going to have a surplus of funds that are going to be lent out, and obviously that's not going to happen in Great Britain. And so then you're going to have the difference between the amount that could be lent at 4%, and the amount that's actually being demanded at 4%, to be the capital outflows from Britain. So then the capital outflows will flow from Britain to the U.S., and so we'll have more savings, and we'll be able to invest more, and then the interest rates will equilibrate, will become equal across international loan markets. So here's just some information on countries with the largest current account surpluses. So again, countries that have current account surpluses means that they're running trade surpluses, right? So if they're running trade surpluses, that means they're going to have excess funds to lend out, right? So therefore, they're going to have capital outflows, countries that have surpluses. So here we've got China, and they have a weak currency policy, meaning that, again, they're trying to keep their currency as low as possible. And so if they're keeping their currency as low as possible, we'll talk about how they do that, by the way, by the end of today. If they're keeping the value of their currency as low as possible, then that is going to attract a lot of buyers internationally for their goods and services, right? Which is what happens. Like, we buy a lot of stuff from China because it's cheap. And so because of that, they're going to have a current account surplus, right? They're going to be selling more than they're going to be buying. And so therefore, they're going to have excess savings. They're going to have net capital outflows, which will come to us sometimes. Like, we talk about how, like, the U.S. has borrowed a bunch of money from China. It's slightly because of this. It's also slightly because, like, our assets are safe just like our dollar. So if they're buying a bunch of our bonds, let's say, and therefore lending us money, they're using those bonds as collateral to then be able to transact internationally. So if they have a bunch of bonds from the U.S. in their banks, then international investors are more willing to engage in international business transactions with China. And therefore, it benefits them to have our assets. So it benefits them to lend us money. And therefore, it's not just like, us, we're borrowing money because we like to borrow money and we have no control over how much money we borrow. That you often hear from the political right. That's not necessarily the complete story. There's two sides to every story, and that's the other side of the story. It benefits China to buy our bonds. Anyway, so that's why they have a large current account surplus. We've got Germany and Japan. They are rich countries with high savings rates. Just in general, the way their countries operate, people tend to save a lot more in those countries than they do like here. And so they tend to have a lot more savings to lend out. And then we've got big oil exporters like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Norway. Again, because they sell a lot of oil, they wind up obviously making a lot of money on that oil. And, a lot of it is just like excess savings that are available to be lent out. So there's a lot of net capital outflows as a result. All right, so let's talk about underlying determinants of these international capital flows. What determines the supply and demand for funds internationally and domestic interest rates? So the main variables are differences in investment opportunities and in savings rates. So as I mentioned, different countries save differently, and also depending on the amount of growth that's exhibiting within a particular country, that's going to be an incentive for investors to invest in a particular country, right? So developing countries, emerging markets as they're called, are big targets for international investors because obviously there's a lot of opportunity there to make a lot of money. So higher growth countries tend to have higher returns for investors, which attracts funds from slower growing countries. So like we're a slower growing country. All developed countries are slower growing countries relative to the developing emerging markets. And so again, those countries tend to offer higher returns for investors. So, our money tends to go there. Countries with higher savings rates tend to export funds more than those with lower savings rates. Now, there's what's called a global savings glut right now, meaning that there's an excess amount of global savings. So in 2005, Ben Bernanke, who was the head of the Federal Reserve before Janet Yellen, who's now the current head, said that the principal causes of the U.S. current account deficit were from outside the country. Special factors caused a global savings glut that pushed down interest rates worldwide. So Bernanke said the main cause was the financial crisis that began in Thailand in 1977, moved through Asia, then hit Russia in 98, Brazil in 99, and Argentina in 2002. Because of that, a lot of investors pulled back from these emerging markets, and they just didn't feel like investing their money elsewhere. So this excess amount of savings just was kind of floating within their countries. As a result, the number of these countries had large capital outflows. For the most part, the capital flowed to the United States and helped fuel our housing bubble. So a lot of folks, including some of the officials from central banks and big name economists, do attribute everything that's happened to us over the last 10 years, including the 2008 crisis, to what happened with this excess amount of savings that all of a sudden became available because, again, these emerging markets started to get into trouble, and they had this sort of financial contagion effect that went from one country to another. It's essentially the same thing as a bank run, but it happens to an entire country. Investors start to get nervous, and then they start to pull out, and then everybody's like, oh, well, things are going bad over here. They're going to start going bad over here. I'm going to start pulling out over here too. Things start going bad there, and then that's like, okay, there's signs that all these countries in this region are bad. Let's just start pulling all the money out, and that's what happened. And it's horrible for the countries because the countries are experiencing growth for the first time. There was a documentary I watched that talked about like in Thailand where they had like built like these amazing skyscrapers and these huge like condominium buildings that were that were meant to house a bunch of business people that are going to work in the skyscrapers, and they were completely empty, just like empty. Because like once this all hit, like nothing happened. Like nobody rented out the spaces, the business, nothing happened, and so it just kind of went to waste. I mean, obviously over time, like people take advantage of these things. They're just sitting around, they buy them for cheap, and they do something with them. But still, like it can be an ugly situation. A question is though, why are there two-way capital flows? Like, why do people in a country where there are ability to borrow go overseas to borrow? And same thing. Like, if you can invest in domestically, why invest internationally? So the United States both sells assets to foreigners and buys assets from foreigners. Why does capital move in both directions? Well, individual investors often seek to diversify against risk by buying stocks in a number of countries. So by investing in a variety of different countries, you are essentially diffusing the probability of it all going to crap, right? So if things go terribly in one country, hey, you have a loss over here, but you've got your money in like these other 5 countries and you're getting some kind of return on that. And so, that makes up for the loss, and you have like a net gain by diversifying, right? It's just the basic logic of any diversification investment strategy that's taken on by hedge funds, investment banks, etc. Corporations often engage in international investment as part of their business strategy. So that's another reason. Some countries, including the United States, are international banking centers. People from all over the world put their money into U.S. financial institutions, and so the UK is also that. So London is like probably the most important financial center in the world, and then New York is like the second most important. And so when you have that, people want to have their money in those places, even though they can have their money at home. So the result of these two-way flows is that modern economies are typically both debtors and creditors. All right, let's take a break and then we'll start talking about the exchange rate. We'll come back at 8:30 and we will finish off this lecture, this final lecture. And I was given this lovely gift. Thank you so much. What was your name again? I'm sorry. Randy. Brandy. Randy, I'm sorry, Randy. She provided me this lovely box of chocolates, which I'm offering all of us. She gave it to all of us, essentially. So I'll have it open right here. Please come by and get some chocolate and enjoy yourselves. And again, thank you, Brandy. Thank you very much. It's very, very thoughtful of you. Let me cut off the recording here.